here. Tom's the editor of our newsletter now and doing an outstanding job, by the way. But he got this letter, and it had to do with a speaker that
well, ladies and gentlemen, we are very fortunate. Many of us in the room may have been here last September of 2001 when our guest speaker was here for the first time, Colonel Joe Cotton. And those of you who were here, I believe, will have very fond memories. And we had a lot of great time and good, down-to-earth wisdom and great stories. And not enough time was left to talk a little bit about some of those magnificent flights that he made. And so he's been gracious enough to volunteer, really, to come back for this encore. And I'd like to say that, just a few remarks for those who hadn't been here last year, that Joe was trained and received his wings in World War II as a fighter pilot. He then, through the way things work magically in the military, and during wartime, he was assigned to fly in a B-17 for a particular mission. And the B-17 was called the Mickey Finn. That's a whole story, and there's part of that in a book that's been published because they were shot down. And they evaded and escaped by commandeering an Italian warship. Now, there's a whole week of memories to go through. So that was quite a start for him. But his real contributions have gone on and on. He's one of the renowned test pilots of our country, really. And he shares that in a very tight fraternity of special pilots. He's a humble man, in my opinion, I think unnecessarily, but we really admire him. And he grew up in Indiana on a farm. He spent 40 years of active flying. Among that time period were 80 or more than 80 different aircraft types that he flew, a lot of it test flying. He has a total of over 16,000 logged hours in high-performance aircraft. Of that, but 12,000 approximately is military, and about 4,000 is commercial. He was the chief test pilot after the Air Force for the United Airlines facility here in San Francisco, and he had a lot of flying and a lot of interactions with Boeing and others. He graduated also at one point from England's Empire Test Pilot School in Farnborough. And he spent a lot of his time at Edwards Air Force Base. So as a return evening, and by the way, I want to mention that this spring, Joe was honored to be the keynote speaker at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. on the Mall. And he prepared some special things for us tonight. I'm through talking. Please help me welcome Colonel Joe Cotton. Oh, we'll set that up.
Is this the one, Dick?
Yep.
When Dick said earlier that it'd been almost a year, I couldn't believe it, but it only brought to mind what, Forrest Gump's mom said, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. But life is really more like a roll of toilet paper. The nearer you get to the end, the faster it goes. And we're going to have a little delay, and maybe some of you'd like to go to the restroom. My wife always says she's going to the bathroom at the airport, and I tell her I bet there's no tub or no shower in there. And she goes anyhow. And I'm going to repeat something that you may have not heard. I talked to a friend yesterday in Hawaii. His name is Tom Sumner. I'm going to use a lot of names. I'm going to name drop tonight. I'm 80 years old. And I found that after you've lived 80 years, that you have an opinion. Number two, you're not afraid to express it, and you don't get much back talk. I think this one. Anyhow, I love names. I've been doing a speech called Come Alive at 75. I think we've talked about tonight, we're the luckiest people in the world for many reasons. And now and then I hear someone, and maybe I might say something about medical science and a little bit of problem with insurance and what have you, but when I think about when I was born on a farm in Indiana, a man's life expectancy was about 47. Now it's 74, and I'm 80. I'm not complaining about anything. And I was thinking about standing in for Ralph Parr. I have never met Ralph Parr, but I'm looking forward to it.
You will.
I was watching our grandson, little Joey Farbstein, play Little League at Trenta Ballpark in San Mateo the other day, and I thought, watching Joey play, and I thought, you know, me standing in over there to speak for Ralph Parr is like little Joey standing in to play for Barry Bonds. I know Ralph must be going through some adjustment problems from his surgery, and I know that there are folks out there, like in our family, you have concerns, and I'd ask you, let's remember in thought and prayer this week for not only Ralph, but I have a dear friend by the name of Click Smith in Washington, D.C. He's a remarkable guy, remarkable. He was a bombardier in Korea, thought he'd like to be a pilot, came back and was a pilot, and he wanted to be a test pilot, and he was the first in his class at Edwards. On top of all that, he's a ordained minister and a brigadier general, maybe a major general. I think Click's a major general. And I was going to visit him when we were back in Washington, and he has multiple myeloma. So if you could remember a special thought and prayer for Joe and Rima's friend Click Smith. Well, I've made about 3 or 4 speeches, maybe 4 since I saw you. One was an important one. And I had never been to Smithsonian before. But Don Lopez is a friend. I've known him for years. He works up there, and he's the deputy director. And I had a tour of the restoration facility, what they're going to put out at the airport, and what a tour. And his boss is a 4-star Marine general, and John Daly. And the more I think about it, and I think of after meeting, they call him Jack Daly, and think about Bill Kepner and Al Boyd and the generals, the few generals that I've met, the more I admire those boards that pick generals. Because believe me, they know what they're doing. I've been so impressed in my life with the people that I've worked for. With that brief introduction, so we can get the projector and the screen set up, I'm doing that because the Smithsonian, their comments were that they wanted to see more about airplanes and less about coming alive at 75. Of course, half of that congregation were less than 30 years old. And they wanted to see it because Confucius said, if you hear, you're aware. If you see, you believe. But it's not until you do that you understand. And that was what Tom Sumner in Hawaii yesterday, he said, Joe, say that again. I'd never heard that before, but it was really true. And that's why I brought some pictures. I'm not sure we can get this thing set up right, but it's better than the one I did in Indianapolis. They had the projector right out there and the screen right behind me, and they projected right, so I just ducked down underneath the podium. Anyhow, could we have a brief break, set the projector up, and the screen.
It's already set over there, Joe.
Pen, give that to Dave. I think the adrenaline flow when you're preparing, thinking about making a speech, even though I feel right at home here as if I were talking to family, the introduction and the preparation to give a talk is a lot like lining up on the runway on your first flight on an airplane and the tower says you're cleared for takeoff. I don't think there's anything like that. Next to it is, and I wanted to tell you that I made a confession here at the head table that I have one real bad habit. Due to my being raised on Indiana farm and testing airplanes early in the morning, I love the early morning. 5 o'clock is my time. And to do that, I found out you have to go to bed early. You can't stay up till midnight and get up at 5, so I go to bed, and you may laugh, at 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night. And if I've had 7 or 7.5 hours of sleep, I'll lay there for a while, and I have the clearest mind and I just think about the wonderful things. And one night I thought, you know, I bet Mikhail Gorbachev thought of perestroika and glasnost while he was laying in bed early one morning. And I just think about the things that I want to say in a speech. And unfortunately, I don't have a knee pad to write them down, because as soon as I get up and the blood drains from my head, I forget them. So I'd just like to run through a few things here, and I've made mistakes, unbelievable mistakes, in the last few speeches that I've made. And after a moment, I'll tell you about them. But a couple of them were the people said they would like to have a look at some airplanes. And so, instead of leading up to this one, I want to start with this one. Here on your left is the nose of the Valkyrie for slow speed flight, and on the right is a windshield, hydraulic actuated, up and streamlined, is for high speed flight. It didn't have a droop snoot like the Concorde. Now there is, you can see, you're going north out of Edwards to Coaldale and headed north. You can see airliners going along, and the windshield is down. And after you get the thing womped up and start folding the wings down, you start the windshield, that's about halfway. Then when you get the tips down full, and you really get moving, and you get the inlets set right and the bypass doors, then the windshield will be full up, and you'll be on the gauges. And then you'll be over on the left side. That's what you'll be looking at. And by the way, that center over there are engine vibration indicators. And you say, how well are you holding altitude? So this was never classified information. But we're not too proud of it. If you have a look, you say, man alive, you're shooting for what, 70 or 71,000 or what? And you notice that is just a 2-minute run. And
was that straight and level, Joe?
You say, any guy would say, turn on the autopilot, and we didn't have an autopilot. And but that's 2 minutes, and you're essentially drifting down from Mach 3 to just a little over 2.8, and you're all over the place, and you say, oh, well, what makes a difference? It's up there. It would make a difference if you were coming the other way at 71,000. So you say, well, how well could you do over a 20 or 30 minute period? And as you can see, not too good. So, people, from the time I started flying in Newcastle, Indiana, Bob told me that my instructor that I'd never have the discipline to be a military pilot. I'd always wondered what he meant by that. I thought he said don't buzz the cows and the chickens and all that sort of thing. But the discipline in an airplane is not, the guy says, have you ever rolled a Hustler, a B-58? I never rolled a Hustler. The Hustler was not a fighter. The Hustler would roll, no sweat. It might damage the gimbals and the bomb nav system and what have you, but I'm a test pilot and I'm not paid to violate the handbook and to do things that what I'm paid for is to try and make that airplane stand still in the air and bring home the data that the engineers want. And discipline to me means plus or minus 20, plus or minus 1, and plus or minus 2. You say, how could you achieve that with a Valkyrie? Well, I'll show you one thing that helped. And that's a vernier right along the side so that you could really look at 1 degree pitch change. Because you want to stay within a quarter or a half a degree or what. And once we did that, then we could do a bit better. That shows a 30-minute run after the attitude indicator had been modified. The purpose of those slides are not to show you at all what we did with a change of instrumentation, but to point out something that I think I should have learned when I was leaving home and starting my road to 80. And a dear African American friend of mine was sitting in a coffee shop one day and he said, Joe, I was thinking about you yesterday in church when our church has a motto, and he wondered if you'd ever heard of it, is attitude determines altitude. And I thought, holy cow, Earl Walker's his name. I said, Earl, I've flown for over 40 years and I never heard it. But when you think about things to inspire kids in the teens today, if they leave home with a good attitude, they can attain any altitude. And that's been the main point of not what I have done for aviation, but what aviation has done for me. I've done nothing for aviation compared to what the airplane and its people, the crew chief, the engineer, and the other guys that I've flown with have done for me. I've learned everything from them. What I am today at 80, I owe so much to the community in Indiana, my mom and dad for my upbringing, but the people I've been associated with. And all I wanted to show you is if you have a proper attitude, you control the airplane and you can control your life. It's not for anybody here, but that's in case you want to transmit that message on to some young folks. And from my indications are, some of them need it. Let me I want to show you the airplane that convinced me that I was not a natural pilot. That's a P-36 with an Allison V-17-10 engine on the front end of it. It did not want you to see the runway that you were about to take off on. It did not want you to raise the tail real early in the takeoff roll. And it seemed to resent the fact that I did not yet have my license to fly it. And I didn't. I flew it about 10 hours before I got my silver wings. But that airplane made me a better pilot. I never realized the purpose of a lot of this until I got about 75 and I could think about it. But there are some airplanes that we all have flown that you either mastered them or they took you down. This airplane, the only reason I got my wings was the fact that I had not ground looped it or augured in it. Because I think there are probably twice as many people lost their lives in training and trying to fly that airplane as were lost in combat. It wasn't easy. I didn't know it wasn't easy until I flew the P-80. There's where contrast in your life is so important. This airplane was an RP-63. I worked on the Allison V-17-10 engine at Indianapolis before I went into service as a kid off of the farm while I was farming too. And this was a pinball machine, a target airplane, and we developed that so that bomber aircrew members could shoot at it and have lights on it. It's a long story, but it's a wonderful story, and for me especially because it got me interested in research and development. And while there at a place called Laredo, Texas, I wanted to fly the B-29, and they had everybody had they left the B-29s there, and they said there was one instructor pilot had left. And I said, has he left the area? And they said, no, but he's been discharged. And I went to a motel. I still think to this day, I don't know whether in life it's more important to make better decisions or to have a good idea. I think having a good idea at times is really worthwhile. So I said, why don't you look this guy up and see if he'll come and fly with you and check you out? And I did it. And there he is, Calvin Worthington. You know, come see Cal, who's a car dealer. 2 weeks ago, I was in my garage working, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and Cal was coming back from Alaska in his Learjet. He'd been up there checking on one of his car deals. Calvin Worthington did me one of the greatest favors of my life. He went out. He was going to Corpus Christi, Texas. He went back out and we flew. You know, the King Ranch is in Texas, and we actually went up and flew up and down a road in a B-29 so it could line up on the runway. Went in and did a few landings, and he signed me off. And so I've always told Cal that I appreciated that more than he would ever believe. And then I didn't know. How many of you have heard an expression of servant leadership? It's a new expression, S-E-R-V-A-N-T, servant leadership. It's a person who's a leader who not only serves his country and his company, but he serves the people that work for him. And that gentleman came from my home state of Indiana, and his name is Bill Kepner, K-E-P-N-E-R. And he was a balloonist before he was chief of the 8th Fighter Group in England, and it was a great privilege to work for Bill Kepner. I have at the end of working for Kepner at a place called Eglin Field, Florida, where they have a huge climatic hangar. I call it a climatic laboratory, where you can take it to 65 degrees below, put airplanes in it, and then get them ready to go to Fairbanks in the winter. While working for General Kepner and enjoying the flying of airplanes like the P-80 and the Bearcat, and I fly anywhere from fighters, medium bombers to heavy bombers up to the B-36. And somebody suggested maybe you ought to go get a test pilot certificate. And so went off to the Empire Test Pilot School in England. What an unbelievable group of airplanes, and what an unbelievable experience. The Sea Fury and the Meteor and the Vampire and sailplanes and what have you. Well, anyhow, after getting through it and learning how to spell differential calculus, because I never really could do it and I haven't used it since, but getting through, I came back and I searched my files to look what I think I looked like as a fledgling test pilot. Very calm and collected, and thought I was pretty cute, and went to Dayton, Ohio, and they started flashing around pictures of airplanes like that. That's a guppy, and somebody been going too fast in it, and so the guys had said, you see there, that's what they call about dynamic pressure. And I said, oh yeah, that doesn't look structurally too sound. And then we had a lot of all-weather work, and these guys had been in hail, and they showed some of that, the B-52, and then Chuck Fisher was out on low level, and the tail came off of 52, and a little closer look. And then I began to look at the schedule about like that, and really wondering whether I had got in the right business or not. But they came along an airplane. Next month in Seattle, they're going to have a bunch of people get together and honor that airplane. That's either 009 or 040. I can't remember. They call them Ma and Pa. They're air refueling airplanes. This B-47 had a Fletcher reel in it. And the project at that time was range extension. Try and get airplanes to go farther. And this B-47, to me, was a lot like the P-40. It made you a better pilot. You had to fly with good discipline to fly the B-47. B-47, I thought, was the bomber pilot's shooting star, the P-80. Very much reminded me of the P-80 when I flew this airplane. But this airplane, you cannot fly this airplane like a B-17. If you don't respect, based on your gross weight, the winds and the runway and everything, if you don't respect the proper approach speed, you can choose which end of the runway you'd like to burn on. It was not a forgiving machine. And I think if I hadn't have really been exposed to this airplane, that I could have handled a couple of 3 airplanes after that. This is a 6-engine B-52. This is the X and the Y. As you'll notice, they have tandem cockpits, and actually the Y flew before the X. And here, I couldn't help but think that the B-47 first flew in 47 and introduced me to 47,000 feet. And the B-52 first flew in 52 and introduced me to about 52,000 feet. And but this had J-57s and afterburning J-75s on the outboard pods. It was 6-engine B-52. I'm just showing you a collection of kind of things that we had to fly at Dayton. We had to fly, we got to fly, and we had to fly them too. And this is 003, which is an A model B-52, which shows we'd go out and load it up with all the ice we could bring, get it home so that engineers could take pictures of it to prove what you could do and see what you could do if the systems failed and you had a heavy load of ice, how many knots to add to your approach speed. I absolutely love that kind of work. This airplane is a mothership for the X-15. This is an A model, and 008 is a B model. Then, about 4 winters, spend in Fairbanks, Alaska. This is a picture of taking on some fuel, either going to or from the North Pole. But there's no big deal of flying in Alaska, as you all know. When you're at -50, it's the getting off that's the hard part. But out of Eglin and Wright-Patterson, cold weather test was a part of it. Then during this time, I thought we were operating more like under Kepner and Al Boyd and all what I call an all leadership type program, where you had one person boss 5 guys. And you'll notice the old man has a grouch on his face and the 5 guys are smiling. And somebody might say, oh, John Boyd, he's really hard to do business with. And the troops would, if they're outside, they loved the old man. They knew he was kind of hard on you, and they appreciated good, honest discipline with example by leadership. And we moved on to Fort Worth to an exciting airplane, a Hustler. You'd say that's a B-58, so it's supposed to fly in 1958. No. You remember, about that time we were going fast, and we were doing a lot of things, and we were maybe running ahead of schedule, because there were 116 of them built, and there were 26 lost. And that's a pretty heavy loss. The Hustler, a B-58, it introduced you to about 58,000, but it didn't wait till 58 to fly. Wondered a lot about that after being in that program for a good while. And about this time we were changing to all management. Instead of one person boss 5 people, we were doing a management business where you had about 5 people bossing 1 worker. We used to laugh about it and say, if my boss calls, get his name. And I've often wondered whether this excess management had something to do with our loss rate. And tires and wheels like that, as Ross Perot said, that dog won't hunt. And to prove it, that's the result.